Welcome to Marketing Matters with WEO Media. I consider today one of our greatest gifts to our clients and to all of our prospects that just tend to follow us because we provide really good content. I frankly couldn't be happier that I have my good friend, Mike Rener, strategic consultant with the Arbinger Institute, with us right here today. Mike, thank you for being here.
Oh, Joseph, it's great to be with you, and thank you so much for the invitation to join in this conversation.
Anyone that knows me knows that it's a very rare conversation that I don't insert Arbinger or Arbinger concepts somewhere in the conversation. And of course, when I speak, I'm able to give much more credit to Arbinger and all that they have taught me and all that they've done for my clients. Um, to begin with my story, and I want to hear yours uh, as to how we were introduced to Arbinger, and then we'll go from there in discussing how we've seen this change people's lives and heal teams that had any degree of dysfunction or inability to maybe communicate in a way that allowed them to maximize their effectiveness and their overall profitability. I was running through an airport in 2001, and at the time I was grabbing any book that had the word leadership on it. And I saw this book, Leadership and Self-Deception, and I picked it up, ran to my flight, and I'm reading it on board. And I get about one third in, and I'm thinking, holy cow, this is unlike any business book I have ever read. And although I hadn't even finished half of it, I could already tell that this was a game changer. This was the most significant book I think I had read on behalf of my clients, knowing that, when you're meeting with clients back when in 2001, I was meeting with clients every week or every other week. And when you do that for years, you kind of create a need for a lot of content. I can't just walk in there and ask how they're doing and review a few numbers and expect to justify an hour and a half of my time to help them accelerate their growth and their productivity. And so I would read a lot, but this book I could see was going to change everything. Every book that I had read up till now was essentially built on the premise of, if you change this, you'll see this, or if you change this behavior, you'll see this result. And that has a lot of value. And I would read a book like that and know exactly what clients that might apply to. Occasionally, I'd buy them the book as well, and we'd go through like one chapter at a time, very methodically over a month or two or a year, which became um, kind of a recipe of our success that I didn't even realize at the time, because I was allowing them to use that generic content and apply it to their own specific situations and needs. But what I often found, Mike, is that there was always a measure of dysfunction, that maybe the communication wasn't where it needed to be, or there was a level of intimidation from the professionals to the rest of the team. And for the most part, a professional is often trained professionally or clinically or um, whatever their field may be, but they're not trained in management and they're not trained in leadership. And in a small professional office, that becomes fairly critical. And so, having been introduced to this book, immediately I started diving in deeper, and just everything that I read just resonated so deep with me and my clients that I began using that book more than any other. In fact, that was a starting point for all of my client relationships. And frankly, if they didn't see if they didn't see that as valuable, as worthwhile, they really weren't a good fit for me because my values were so consistent with Arbinger Institute as an organization and just as a basic fundamental set of values on how we should treat each other and how we should view each other. And so I began using it and taking my clients to courses. I went to one of the very first 2-day courses that was called the Outward Mindset. And for 2 days, it was just whoa! It was one of the greatest experiences I think I've ever had professionally. And so that was my introduction to Arbinger. And I just could not be more grateful that I found them early on when I did. What was your experience, Mike? How did you find Arbinger? And of course, now you're a full-time strategic consultant with the Arbinger Institute. Take us back to your first introduction to Arbinger. How'd you find out?
Well, it was not too long after you were introduced to the book Leadership and Self-Deception that I was. And I was given that book. Well, I wasn't necessarily given that book because it is sometimes interesting to think about if you were to gift a book to somebody else called Leadership and Self-Deception, that sometimes that can bring almost this like subtle accusation and how you're gifting that to somebody. But I was at the time working for a very small organization, and my then boss, the owner of this company, he came back from a weekend retreat where him and his wife, they would always go once a year, and they would just kind of like be together, and they would kind of plot out their goals for the upcoming year and everything. And he was in a bookstore, and he picked up the book Leadership and Self-Deception. This is a story he told me. He picked up Leadership and Self-Deception. He flipped through it, and he put it back on the shelf, and he turned, and he said the book actually fell off the shelf. And he like took that as some kind of a sign that he had to like pick up. It's just like, and so he picked up the book, and in his words, he consumed it cover to cover. And he came back so hot wanting to talk about this book with somebody else that I was like, oh, well, look, in some ways I was like, look, I'll appease you and I'll just go and get this book and I'll read it. And I wasn't at all as introspective as you were back then, Joseph, the first time I read the book, because I read the book. I certainly didn't read it cover to cover, but I read the book and I got done with it. And I kind of thought, well, look, this brings an amazing perspective to how people are such a problem in the world, and I just put it back on the shelf. And I don't know if it was just because of some of the follow-up discussions that I had with him led me to revisit the book. But this time I did. It was a couple of weeks later, and I picked that book up, and I did from cover to cover. I just remember sitting in my living room, and I read that thing cover to cover. And this time I read it in a whole kind of a different spirit where I feel like I saw myself in the narrative in a way that I didn't the first time I read it. And so it was through that I found just aspects of our human experience elevated in some way. I was so intrigued that I looked up the Arbinger Institute because, look, I'm from Michigan originally, and I had moved out to the greater Salt Lake City area at this time. And I happened to look up the Arbinger Institute, and I saw that they were headquartered right here in Salt Lake City, and that they offered the public 2-day course that you were talking about. And so this was, I think it was in 2003, I signed up to go and attend that. And after going through those 2 days, it took my intrigue to a whole other place, to where I just became a student of Arbinger's work throughout the 2000s. And so that was my introduction to Arbinger.
Oh my goodness. And then you became a facilitator like I am, but then your career with Arbinger uh, took off from that point on. I couldn't be more thrilled that they absorbed you as much as you absorbed Arbinger, because you've been such a great contribution to that organization. You really adopted deeply what that organization is all about. One of the things that I think we've both seen in the workplace in general is that we we tend to go places in our interactions with others that are not healthy. And I know, speaking personally, uh, it was very easy for me to drag my old self and my old hangups or my own hangups into a work relationship in which I might become intimidated. I easily jump to conclusions, and I think the one philosophy that is as basic as it is, to be able to realize that we don't always see people as people, and that we have this ability to actually reduce them to an object. And there's several categories there we can talk about. But when we do that, and I know I was a master at it, I could rationalize, justify, I could without even knowing what I was doing, I was attempting to justify why the relationship wasn't working. And I wasn't assuming any responsibility for that. I could always blame. And I had no idea back then how much blaming is really a red flag for seeing someone other than a person. To be able to bring that into the workplace, we don't really think about that as essential as it is in order to maximize our productivity and ultimately our profitability. And so that's one reason why I had so much fun with and use for the Arbinger concepts. I would often do the same thing. I'd buy everyone a book, and we'd methodically go through it. Although with Arbinger, particularly the three books that they have that introduces the concepts, it's kind of hard to take it one chapter at a time. You kind of want to read the whole book so you know where you're going, and then you can go in a number of places. You get me on Arbinger, and I could just go on and on. But where do we go from here, Mike? I mean, what has your experience been?
Yeah, well, gosh, my experience has been that one thing, but maybe it might be helpful to start. What's the fundamental problem that exists in our human experience, and how in the world did Arbinger's founders find a way to be able to get at that? Would that be okay to start there?
Yeah, let's do.
Because and look, we'll use our life experience to kind of play with this idea here, but you and I, everybody listening, we've all come across people who have a problem, you know, and we don't need any help in translating that experience in others when other people are a problem. And yet, if we were to think, would they see and admit to the very problem we think they have? And the answer to that is no. So how is it possible that somebody can have a problem and not see that they do? Because inherent in that is also then this resistance to doing anything about it or changing. And so here we have, and now look, here's the other thing, Joseph, and this is why I think this material hit home with us too, is that if that's true in others, well, why isn't that true in us? How is it possible that we can be blind to the kind of impact that we have on others? And therefore then be able to get reconnected to the kind of truth that does exist in terms of me seeing more clearly, me being in relation to others more clearly, me impacting others more clearly. But that is the general premise in terms of here we have people going about living their life or doing their work in a way that actually isn't helpful to other people. You know, and that, especially when you translate that into a workplace dynamic. I mean, look, we can spend a whole other 2 days talking about what this means, in terms of a family life. But as we are thinking about the workplace dynamic specifically, you have people who can't self-evaluate at that level. Well, then there's a lack of thinking about what it means to be accountable. Because I think we see that, because look, how often have you heard that, Joseph, as a buzzword, that that's an organizational symptom?
Oh, yeah.
You know, we've got people who just aren't accountable, or how often you've coached a leader who comes to you and is like, I have people who aren't being accountable, and we get into that. Tell me more about that. Well, so it shows up now as that is just one symptom of this deeper disease that exists, and how we don't know how to typically get at that within organizations. And so Arbinger's work really stood up as, even though it had rigorous kind of this academic underpinning in philosophy and psychology, back in the really late 70s, there was an invitation for Arbinger's founder to go actually work with an organization. And the results that happened within that team over the course of 3 days was transformative. And that is where this, this work, which really was, how can people just be better in families and communities? Well, now you're able to see, wait a minute, this really helps people be way more effective in the workplace, which means organizations would be willing to invest in this because there's a direct ROI, which means this is how people can get their hands on it and go home differently. And if they go home differently, they're in community differently.
Yeah, that has been my experience every time I've shared it, professionally and otherwise. Yeah, to answer your question, Mike, I generally see three dysfunctions in a dental: poor communication, information breakdown. Managing a team can often be challenging. There's often no regular team meetings. They can be so busy seeing patients that taking time to communicate to the entire team can be lacking. And there's often a fear of conflict. Number two is a lack of accountability and maybe poor leadership. Since everyone feels like family, it's easy to delay hard conversations. And the third one is a toxic team culture where there's gossip, negative talk, and conflict. We're talking about constant stress in dentistry, and that can amplify venting and negative talk. Leaders often don't intervene early enough, which can really contribute to a negative, toxic culture. And 30% cite quitting because of a toxic environment. So those are the real big three that I see most common in the dental industry.
Well, if we think about an organization specifically, you brought up leadership. We often think that the responsibility of a leader is to hold people accountable for the work that they're doing. And that right there is kind of a way of adopting an old management style. But yet there are so many things that are around teaching leaders how to do that effectively. But all the while, they don't take care of the variable of me as a leader that might actually be inviting the very lack of accountability that I'm complaining about. And so that is also something that, as we talk about this blindness and this resistance is also inherent in this idea of, this idea of self-deception, or what we kind of try to strip out some of the philosophy around that. We refer to that kind of way of being as having an inward mindset where I don't see myself clearly. I don't see others clearly. And therefore I don't even see my objectives clearly. I don't see problems and situations and circumstances clearly because I see all of them in terms of what they mean for me. And so when you think about a manager who is now faced with this, hey, I've already seen that what I have are employees who aren't being accountable. Well, often it's showing up in two ways, but we'll typically just, let's say, talk about the first one, that it's a performance related thing. And well, seeing them as the problem, well, there's all sorts of things that I now, as, somebody who's not committed, somebody who doesn't care, somebody who's not driven, they're not self-motivated, all of these things and how I see them. Well, you think, so what are all the things that I do with an employee like that? Well, what are all the things that I've been trained to do? I put them on a performance review plan. I certainly make sure I have the right kind of difficult conversations with them. I point out exactly what I'm seeing and what needs to happen and all these other things. But if we just pause that story for a second and ask another question that's pivotal to see where the rest of that story goes and think, do people respond? Like, for instance, Joseph, do we respond to others through just their behavior or their regard for us?
It's deeper than behavior, isn't it?
It is. So we know that because we've given an apology before that we felt somebody didn't mean it, or we felt like somebody was saying something nice about us just to butter us up, that it wasn't sincere. So there's this underlying component to just how we relate to each other, which means our regard for others, or this idea of mindset that Arbinger's work kind of gets at, is that our mindset actually drives and informs not just what we do, but the impact of what we do. And so going back to this story, let's say with me and this direct report, who I would say is an accountability issue, the way I see them and everything I do they're not responding to all these polished behaviors and skills. They're responding to my regard for them. And in doing so, they see me now as a leader who is micromanaging, is worried about profits, self-concerned, doesn't care, not interested in my growth, all these other things. And so we then ask the question, if my employee is seeing me like that, is that going to invite them to be less or more accountable? It's most likely in those cases, if they want to keep their job, they just do the bare minimum. So they'll just simply comply. Well, we can keep going on this. Me seeing, a direct report who's just simply compliant, I can just add to that list now.
Yeah, now you can add to the list that they're just going through the motions. They really don't want to be here. I can tell in their attitude. We refer to attitude. We refer to that all the time, don't we? As such a blanket statement. They just have a bad attitude.
Yeah.
What is that? What does that mean, really? I mean, and how much are we a part of that as leaders?
Yeah, well, in coming back, so there's this other piece of, because sometimes we think about accountability as just reference to, they're not performing and they're not holding themselves accountable to that performance. Well, there's another piece that, accountability is, we help people see that what true accountability means is being accountable for the impact of what we do. Like, for instance, as a father, I could be responsible for bath time and bedtime with my child, and I can go through that bath time and bedtime process, just checking that off my list. And I can see my daughter in terms of how she's either helping me or hindering me with what my job is. And in the cases where she's helping me just move along in that, boom, I'm able to check the box. But if she's in my way of that, making things difficult for me, that's going to cause that whole entire evening to not go very well. To the extent that my wife's going to be like, Mike, what in the world's going on up there? And I'm going to have every excuse in the world to point how unreasonable my child is being. And what has she even been doing all day? That now I'm stuck with this kind of attitude in the evening. So we think about things like accountability from a perspective of, I've done a job. But no, I can do my job in a way that is actually deeply accountable for the impact of what I do on others. And when we think about what that means in terms of bath time for a 4-year-old, their objective isn't to get clean, is it, Joseph?
Mm-hmm.
Their objective is to have fun. Mm-hmm. And if I approach bath time with that in mind, it completely transforms how I do it. Which now we think, there's a level of accountability that we see there, that I'm now thinking about my accountability around the impact of how I do my work, but also then how that allows everything else to flow, later on. You translate now that easy to the kind of work that we do within our organizations. We think I can do my work in a way that actually doesn't take others into account. It doesn't take others into account relative to their needs, objectives, challenges. And I can do my work to the extent that, check, I've checked the box. I've done it. But again, we're talking about a level of being accountable or being able to see at a deeper level the kind of impact that I have on that. And am I able to do my work in a way? Do I see, like what you mentioned earlier, am I seeing people around me with those hopes, needs, objectives, concerns, worries, wants, challenges? Am I able to see those enough so I'm able to take that into account so I can be informed of how to do my work in a way that's either helpful or actually doesn't hinder other people, right? So that there's a way of thinking about accountability even in a deeper sense. And certainly from a manager's perspective, I don't want to be in the job of holding people accountable. But how can I put an accountability and an ownership of that in them? Can I instill that within my direct reports to help them think about? And these 3 things I think are really important to consider as leaders. What are we ultimately scaling both in our life? Then what does that mean within our direct reports? And if I can help my team members think about self-evaluating around that kind of idea, the kind of impact that we have on others, and give them tools to be able to self-correct at that level, now there's a level of self-accountability that exists. And that's the kind of accountability I want, right? My job as a leader is only to point out things around accountability when it's not being taken themselves, when that direct report isn't being accountable themselves. That's the only time I have to step in around that. Mm-hmm. Thoughts about that or how that matches to your experience and what you've even coached people to?
Yeah, you're talking about helping people become accountable versus training people or holding people accountable. That's a big difference, isn't it? Leadership is full of all these methods and strategies for holding people accountable, systems for holding people accountable. But you're talking about accountability in an entirely different way. I think what I've come to see is that one of those ways is seeing them as a problem or as maybe an obstacle to what I just want them to do. And the other way sees them more as a person that I want to help, that I want to encourage to be their best self. I think that's where we see that change in which someone most people want to be accountable. They want to be accountable people, but that gets messy with a leader that maybe doesn't understand how to hold themselves as accountable as those that they wish were more accountable. And that requires some introspection, doesn't it?
It does, but yet at the same time, I can't wait for other people to be accountable around me to think about what responsibility taking looks in me. In fact, when I see other people not being accountable, even that if that's my leader, well, I can use that as an excuse to do less than my best, can't I?
Yeah.
And we will seize on those things that that justify how I see myself and others in that sense. And that idea, justification, you brought it up earlier. That we can go on and on talking about that idea too. But anyways, what else were you thinking about, Joseph? What else were you thinking about in terms of just where this work can apply and what might bring meaning to the listeners out there?
Maybe one of them is a bit personal on our side as a marketing company, in that we know all the science behind how to make the phone ring. It is literally an exact science, and more today than ever in the history of business. We know how to make the phone ring. We know how to attract the right people that practice may be looking for. But the problem comes from, it's very easy for us as a marketing company or any marketing company to maybe blame, when we get blamed, when we get blamed for not maybe making the needle move, so to speak, when they just won't answer the phone. We're making the phone ring, but they're not answering the phone. They're not accountable. They're just not being responsible for answering the phone when we're making the phone ring. And you can see the problem that creates, right? Using that as just an example. We want them to be better trained. We wish they would be more accountable to answering the phone and saying all the right things, maybe investing in training on how to answer the phone to attract the people or keep the people or schedule the people that they're wanting, that they're already investing in to make the phone ring. But when they don't, what are we left to do as a marketing company? Um, and and can you see how there's this blame game that often takes place between a marketing company and their client? And what when you feel blamed, what do you tend to do?
Yeah. Well, okay. So Joseph, this example that you bring up, you can even think about this within an organization as it pertains to a sales and marketing team. I mean, a marketing team's whole entire thrust is to bring potential customers, clients to the door, and then the sales team can open up that door and usher them to a place of potential future partnership. Well, there's so many times where the marketing team is doing what they feel as though is the job well done. But if the sales team is, and geez, you know what? What if they're busy? What if they're actually busy taking care of other people? Or the call's ringing after hours for some reason? Well, from a marketing team perspective, I can look at them and I can see them as a problem. I can see them as, well, they don't follow through. They don't follow up for that matter. They're not even skilled and trained. They don't even know what they're doing. We're working super hard over here, so therefore they're not really working anywhere near as hard over there. In fact, they're way overpaid. We don't get enough credit and appreciation. Like, there is on and on. Like, we can go about this, can't we? And you think now, look, if I'm seeing a sales team like that, you think, so what do I do? I can actually start thinking about all the data that is in my favor and bringing that to the table. Do you see how many leads we presented that didn't have any kind of follow through to them? And also, these are all the leads that didn't have more than one follow up.
Sounds like justification, doesn't it?
Well, it's like, I will reach for evidence that proves how I see the other is right. But it also fuels everything I do and I spend my time on. Notice, when I'm caught up in those things, I don't think about what are we doing that might be causing that to happen? Or is there something, or during a certain time of day, or are we running our ads? Are we doing this? Or are we inviting people to call during a certain time frame even that's the rush for them? What can we do, or what can we learn? Like, all of a sudden, the curiosity button is not even being pushed, is it? It's just like, it actually doesn't even exist for me, because I've already assumed, I've already sized the group up, and now I do all my work in terms of how they're affecting us. So everything that I do is in that light, and that's not really focused on the right kind of result, is it? That's not being nimble to think, hey, how can we make sure we're holding our feet to the fire in terms of the kind of impact that we have here? How can we do that? And all of a sudden, that takes us to a place of thinking more creatively. And when we start thinking outside of ourselves, we are able to start thinking way more creatively, way more innovatively than we were when we start thinking creatively around how to advance our own result, or to substantiate a claim in which, this is the work that we're doing. This is why we're working so dang hard over here. Dang it. So look, we can easily, the moment we start to see the other as a problem, we create a problem. We end up actually inviting and provoking the very thing that we complain about. And that's a significant claim, isn't it? We end up provoking the very thing that we complain about. And the question is, why in the world would we ever do that? Why? Well, because it gives us what we need most. It gives us the justification we need for how we see them. So that as that data starts coming in, here's all the more leads that we're giving this group, that, there's only one follow-up or none follow-up. But see, this proves exactly why this group is such a problem. And now I just start hitting my head up against the wall that there is no effort that we can do, no campaign that we can run that would actually help solve this group's issue over there. But yet, as a team, we just think, wait, okay, this team has a problem. It's not that they are a problem. It's that, what if this team has a problem? Well, what's that problem? They're busy, they're inundated, they do not have the system to kind of keep things tracking, whatever. Who knows what that is? But if we can get curious about that, we can understand how we can adjust. Hey, this is what we're doing over here. This is what we're seeing. What can we do to be able to help that go right? The possibilities are totally different, aren't they? In terms of what's available to us. But we're able to start to see the problem differently. But unless and until I can actually start thinking outside of myself and actually start seeing another with hopes and challenges and concerns of their own, then, well, we're stuck. Now, you can start digging in deeper than that. You can think, well, yeah, but what if you do all of that stuff and nothing changes? Well, what then? Well, look, that's where it's up to me to think I can continue to work in an organization where this kind of activity I find not enjoyable. That's not the right word. I find advantage in, because what you mentioned before, like, there are people that leave because of toxic cultures. Well, there's only 30% of them, Joseph. I want you to think about the other 70% in the organization that thrives in a toxic culture. That's not a statistic we're thinking about. So if you think, wait, well, how is it, if there's a true toxic culture and there's a bunch of people working within that, staying within that, even though people are stressed out to the max and saying they want something else, we can actually find advantage in that space. Because and this comes back to a word that you used before, I have plenty of people to blame. And when I have plenty of people to blame, it's easy for me to think about not being accountable in that space. And while I would preach accountability, I would preach collaboration, I would preach engagement, all of those things. When my mindset is inward, I can actually thrive in toxic cultures because it's a great place to hide. It is a great place to hide. And that's why you sometimes see that people just stay on in those places. So I think that's such an interesting metric, isn't it? 30% of people leave because of a toxic culture. Well, what about those 70%? Well, let's talk about what's happening there, And if I could keep going with this, because if I'm in that kind of way of seeing others and the kind of blame that I have towards others relative to the work that I'm trying to do and the kind of excuse that I have in terms of how it's just, I see others in terms of how they're affecting me. I'm not at all thinking about how I impact others. I'm not thinking about that level of accountability. And the only way I'm thinking about accountability is how other people aren't accountable to me in so many other ways, is that I will find advantage in other people failing, because that is also justification for me, isn't it?
It sure is.
Like, I will also find advantage there. Can I tell you a quick story about this? This is one of my own life experiences here. And this was years ago. I joined a small sales team. There are 6 of us, I think, on this team. And when I joined, this one person, Phil, it seemed like from day one, Phil and I just went the rounds. You can kind of equate what that means, right? Just never got along. And if Phil said something, I was just immediately bothered with it. I'm sure it was the exact same thing with me. Well, in this sales team, we had revenue targets that were based on quarterly goals. And we bonused on them. So if we reached our individual goal, we would bonus on that each quarter. But we also had a team goal, Joseph, that if the team hit a certain target, the team would also all bonus on. And why do you suppose we had a team goal? Why are there team incentives in place like that?
Mm-hmm.
So
that you work together?
So we work together. It's almost like this carrot of, do you see, you guys, if all you do is work together, then you're able to obtain this. And so we even see that there are systems put in place within organizations that are all trying to jockey to get people to actually work together and collaborate. Well, I will tell you that there are people like me that can completely undercut a system like that. So here we have these goals, but we also had this dashboard that provided clear visibility to where everybody was tracking. Meaning that, everybody could see my goals, I could see everybody else's goals, and I have no idea which quarter this was. So let's say it was first quarter. And it was probably mid-March, let's say, and I hit my goal, which means all of a sudden I'm super concerned about where everybody else is relative to their goal and our team goal. And so that's like the first time that I'm like checking in on the dashboard to see where everybody else is at. And I see at that time that the gap that we are off on our team goal is about the exact same to an individual who is off on their goal. And guess who that was?
Was it you?
It was Phil.
It was, yeah.
And do you suppose at that time I thought, oh, you know what? Let's rally the team to see how we can help Phil.
I kind of doubt that you did that.
Yeah. And how were my conversations with the rest of the team? You think about Phil, weighing us down, not carrying his weight, doesn't pull through. And look, I felt like it was all of a sudden my job, because I questioned, was our manager doing it? Like, it was my job to check in to see if there's anything that is happening. And certainly, as days and the weeks go by, there's just no movement. There's nothing new even coming into the pipeline that would prove to be a new opportunity that, I think if this was happen. This was like 2 days before the end of the quarter. And Phil lands this massive contract that sends him hurtling over his individual goal, and we catapult over our team goal. And so here's a question, Joseph. You think I was happy?
You were actually disappointed. Isn't that the truth?
That's right. Because look, what did I need in Phil? This whole time I needed a Phil who was blameworthy, wasn't I? right? And even when Phil came through for the team, I still needed a Phil that was blameworthy. Now, look, if you were to ask me at any stage of the game what I would want most out of Phil, intellectually, I would respond to that as pull on through, Phil, right? Like full steam ahead, we're behind you. Like, right? I would preach that all day long. But yet, no, that's not what my inward mindset actually needed out of Phil. What I needed was the kind of Phil who was blameworthy. And for him to be successful and actually help advance a team's objective, that did not fit into that puzzle piece of need for me, did it? And I remember walking into Phil's office, probably with a certain level of arrogance, sitting across from him, and I look right at him. I said, well, aren't you lucky? To me, it had to be luck. He needed to know that, oh, this was just luck. It wasn't about hard work or diligence enough. Somebody woke up today and wanted to write a check, and it just so happened Phil was on the receiving end of that chance. So it's interesting to think that when our mindsets are inward, we are blind to how we see others, how we see problems and challenges. And that blindness ends up even getting reinforced because of the justifications we seek, which end up actually providing the very evidence to how we see ourselves, others, situations is right. And in these settings, when my mindset is inward towards others, I'm often not rooting for their success. In fact, I will come, and this is a pretty bold claim, that just where the logic flows around Arbinger's work, where it goes, is that when my mindset is inward, I will come to value justification more highly than success or happiness, which is crazy to think about, isn't it?
It's absurd, isn't it? It's absolutely absurd.
It's absolutely absurd. But in this whole entire story with Phil, I would have financially benefited from his success, right? So I would have rooted for that all day long. But yet, no, I needed a Phil who was blameworthy. That trumped everything else. So I will come to value and prize justification more highly than success or happiness. And so even coming back to this idea of this 70% that stays in a toxic work culture, well, we can see now where the logic takes us. We can come to prize being justified more than being happy. And how many times have we heard in organizations people just aren't happy in their work?
Right. And I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to connect the dots on how that culture would impact profitability. Right?
Oh yeah, because it gets absorbed, Joseph, in the cost of doing business. There's no column on a profit and loss statement that is for inward mindset work activity. Nope, it just gets absorbed in terms of what our turnover rate looks like, or retention, or customers that we lose, and contracts that we're no longer to update. There are a host of things that are byproducts like this that just get absorbed in the cost of doing business. And so, look, we've talked a whole bunch about how it shows up and the problem that it is. You start to think, well, what in the world do you do about it? Because here, if we've just elevated the fact that if people have a problem and they can't see that they do, and they're resistant to any kind of change, well, what in the world do you do with that? What in the world do you do with that? Well, the typical approach is let's hit it with every behavioral prescription effort that we can do. And, we'll come at it now. And, I want you to think of the equivalent of walking down a drugstore aisle as a leader. And on the shelf, you see all of these medications for like things that you brought up before, communication issues. And there's the really costly, well-known brands. And then there's all the no brands of those, and now we just get to pick, do we want to spend the most money on the communication fix, or do we want to just go cheap? Okay, what does our budget allow? And we're just walking down and we see all of these things. We see communication. We see accountability things. We see collaboration things. We see conflict medication, all of these things. And we have as leaders, and we see it's just pervasive in the marketplace. We walk down these aisles and we just continue to shop for remedies to fix the symptoms that we are experiencing. But all of those things are symptoms of a deeper disease. And if we can get surgical on that disease, well, then those will slowly begin to dissipate, slowly begin to dissipate. And so look, how do you do that? How do you do that effectively? And that's kind of at the crux of where Arbinger's work is able to give people, and you and I have kind of been able to learn a language to be able to think about how do we self-evaluate around that problem that we're inherently resistant to? And then how are we given tools to consider, what does that mean for somebody with the work responsibilities that I have? What about the responsibilities that I have at home or in community or in just my personal life, right? I still have people that I affect in the way that I do my work and how I live my life. And if I'm able to get oriented to a way of thinking about, how does my work and the things that I do help other people accomplish their objectives, that informs me of how I do it. It informs me of how I get it done. And therein, quite frankly, I think just the wave of where our new workforce and generation is coming from, nobody wants to be micromanaged. Everybody is done working under the guise of any kind of command and control system. And quite frankly, I think the pendulum has shifted so much in the other direction of almost like, okay, just kind of be free, do whatever you want in some cases. But we're still not giving people the equipment to really think about, how can they really think about the kind of impact that they have on each other? And can I be a leader that is, one, in a place to think about my impact on my team? Am I the kind of leader that's really thinking about holding my feet to the fire of, am I aware of the needs and objectives and challenges of my team? Do I understand where they want to go and how they want to grow? Because now my course correction of them when things falter is in response to what their needs and objectives are. It's not something that I want to see and change in them, but rather you're coming at me as my leader saying, Mike, look, I know that you want to one day be in a potential candidate seat to take on my role when I retire. And when I see you do X, I see in that as somebody who's drifting away from being that kind of candidate. Do you see why doing X can't happen anymore? Do you see why that's important to you? Okay, Mike, what's your plan to get back on track? How can I help you with that? Notice you're not telling me, Mike, this is the list that you now need to follow to do that. It's no, Mike, what's your plan? What do you need to do? What are you taking ownership around? And so, because now I see in Joseph and somebody like you, somebody who actually cares about my growth and development, who's willing to help me get back on the very track that I committed to you that I want, and now your correction of me feels so much more like teaching. It feels so much more like mentorship and teaching than it does anything that's punitive or disciplinary.
And which would we most likely respond to favorably, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And so if we're able to just kind of unlock a level of being curious around the people around us that we are already right now very resistant to, I bet we will begin to see in others some things in them that we can now respond to differently. We can respond to differently because you and I can go about our world and we've already sized people up because we've come across somebody who has been an accountant or who has been an engineer or who has been in software development or who has, like, the list will go on with every single label you could attach to somebody. And because we've had one of these inward mindset experiences with them, well, everybody else must be just like them. We can go about how many times have you heard, oh, that's the millennials for you?
Mm-hmm.
That's Gen Z for you. There are things that we do that we will end up not just blaming each other, but I will label other people like you. It's not just Phil. It's other people like Phil, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's where this can permeate into other space. But being able to unlock that and see the individual uniquenesses that we all have and what it really means to see a person. Well, it means like there's so much in a person. And do I even step forward into an ounce of curiosity around what that is? And I don't even need to know the full person to know innately what people need and how to just be subtly aware of that.
Because being a human is something we all know how to do. I remember you teaching that very concept or that insight, if you will, that that we already know instinctively how to walk into a bad place, like justification and self-deception, and we know how to get out of that box. We know how to do that. We've done it before. But with Arbinger, it's like we learn a language not to make it a click, but to give us more power to utilize that language to get out of the box faster. I spend less time in the box now. I still go into the box, but because I understand the terminology, I spend less time, hopefully, in the box toward colleagues and loved ones than I ever did before. But before I understood this language, I could not self-diagnose where I was versus where I wanted to be, or where the organization needed me to be, or my family needed me to be. Does that make sense?
Oh, it does. Yeah. And you're using that term, the box, as synonymous with what an inward mindset is in our experience, right? And, but, oh, sure. And look, you know what? There is something to be said about, just because you see now this dimension in our life doesn't now mean we are free
Right. Right.
of,
It's like, okay,
of
now
this.
what?
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
it doesn't mean all of a sudden we have stepped into this. I'd like to think, in that movie, The Matrix, when they hand, I forget, was it Morpheus who hands, like there's two pills that are put out there. Which pill do you want to take? You take this pill, and it's all right. You will just go back to living in this world, to where uh, this is what you know. But you take this pill, you now know that world, but you also know this other world. And in a lot of ways, there's a parallel within Arbinger's work. It's that we are right now kind of living in this space of seeing the world in ways that we respond to people, but we're also responding to objects. And we have justifications that flood our experience and also are laced within our narrative. And yet, no, you start getting connected to this dimension of our human experience. You start seeing, just like in that movie Matrix, look, wait, there's this world, but there's also this other dimension. And both of them exist, which means that I'm not free of this other place that an inward mindset can take me. There's not a day that goes by where I don't think I spend time there. But yet, seeing it is part of the cure. Being able to, and I've heard that before. I forget who said that at Arbinger, that sometimes the diagnosis is a step towards a cure, isn't it?
Oh yeah. And if you misdiagnose, there's nothing you can do. You're powerless because you can't. There is no opportunity for change if you misdiagnose. And when you think about how that misdiagnosis is usually about us and about the way we're seeing the world or the way we see others, actually is a two-edged sword, isn't it? It's like that actually that frees me on one level because I don't have to wait for someone else to change. But on the other hand, now I have to own that. It all begins with me. It's like that's a lot of weight. And I think in my first training experience with Arbinger, that's what I was often doing is, whoa, I have so much room for growth here. I just never saw it before. I just never saw it that way. So you kind of have to be patient with yourself when you enter, this type of leadership training. But there, in my mind, given everything that I've seen about leadership training, this is like leadership 505. This is the most advanced leadership training I have ever been exposed to. And just learning it once is never like you're just starting. I feel like after 25 years, I'm still just starting again and again to master the concepts that I know are true and helpful and productive if I want to be a happier person. And if I want to live around people that are happier, that I'm not triggering unknowingly to be miserable like myself. It's just such an anomaly there for me. I, I still do it. Hopefully I do it less than I used to.
Well, I'm in that same boat. As as do all the people that work and live with me. They feel that same way in hopes that I just do that less.
Oh, Mike, how would someone? We talked about being introduced to these concepts through the book that we loved, and it was the first book, right, that Arbinger wrote. Since then, there have been other publications. What would you suggest if someone was listening to this and thought, you know what, I might really benefit from this, and often it's like, oh, I need my office manager to listen to this because that's where the problem really is. If she or he can listen to this, and my problems will be over, and I know everything will run smoother in my office if we can just have so and so read the book. Even when that might be your first impulse, if someone was to want to go deeper than what we have just touched on on the surface of some of these principles,
Yeah.
what would you suggest?
Yeah. And, I think it's, as you made mention, there's like there are levels of learning. You said this is like a 500 level coursework. Well, Arbinger's got 101.
That's true.
And I think,
Yep.
I think Arbinger 101 are some of those books. So you've got Leadership and Self-Deception, The Anatomy of Peace, which is really written as a prequel. And the context of that is, while Leadership and Self-Deception is written in more of an organizational context, The Anatomy of Peace really takes that more to family, community, and even a geopolitical kind of context that's thrown in there. And then the Outward Mindset book. And the Outward Mindset book is a little bit more, while there are stories riddled within it and ways to be able to bring certain languages and frameworks to bear, it's written like around a series of case studies. So those books, I think, are a fantastic way to be able to get in there. But yet those, I would even say, look, yes, it does cost money to order those books, but there are also things, whether you look on YouTube around Arbinger's work. Arbinger released a podcast called Leading Outward. And since, people are podcasters who are listening to this, I'm sure just like you and I, there's multiple podcasts that we tune into and listen to. And that podcast just brings a lot of people into the fray of learning from each other through their own life experience and their stories. And so if you're looking to level up from there and actually invest more time and resources than just like what you and I did, we went to a public course. And so Arbinger offers public courses both in Salt Lake City and Washington, D.C. area, along with virtual courses that allow somebody to go through certainly a deeper level of what this material does in terms of become all the more relevant and relatable to people. So it can move them to be taking action in different areas of their life and their work responsibilities. And certainly we have also often work within organizations. We go in organizations and we work with senior leadership teams and spend time with them, whether it be through training, consulting, or coaching, or a combination of all of those. And yet what I love is that people within organizations can also get trained and certified as facilitators to go back and teach that internally. And you connected me to somebody who's been a dear friend ever since that connection. And that's what he did. He went through a facilitator training, take this back to his organization and teach and deliver that. And that impact still continues to this day, Joseph. I was just on a call yesterday for somebody who is 2 levels down from him in the organization and has talked about the kind of leader he is and whatnot. And so those are all some ways to be able to patch in to a way of really thinking about a learning journey that honestly doesn't stop. And, when you mentioned it's kind of like, this is like 500 level leadership. Well, the irony is everybody's living it already.
Yeah.
Everybody's living it already. It's just what we don't see ends up being the problem. And we're able to bring clarity to that kind of experience that all of a sudden ends up becoming something that is so foundational that now everything else, sometimes it's almost like we take for granted the air that we breathe. We're so busy focusing on all these other activities, we miss out on the fact that, oh, wait a minute, oxygen fuels me to be able to do all this stuff. And so in a way, we're still breathing. We're just not maximizing that oxygen in the way that we otherwise could. And so if we actually like seeing that importance of what that means, in our work, we're just able to respond totally differently. And so, Joseph, does that help in terms of some of the ways people can access some?
Yes, it does. And you reminded me of something I just heard through our mutual friend, uh, who you had on a podcast, Arbinger podcast. And what was the story related to someone that you also know who listened to that podcast and commented on the impact that that episode had and how? What was the story
Sure.
on that?
Well, in that episode specifically, Darren, he talks about how an experience where he became bothered that customers came in the door. Because can't we see sometimes, though, what would otherwise be readily great opportunities, we see that as all of a sudden a disturbance on what we're trying to do. So yeah, I mean, he just paints this wonderful story about, hey, we can even objectify the very people that help keep the lights on in our business. And he just tells this brilliant story. Well, somebody else, another client of Arbinger, he listened to that story and he sent it to his entire network to be able to listen to it, because how often their schedules are so back to back to back to back that they end up seeing how, when somebody else is added to this schedule, or they're asked to being, hey, can you insert this? Or, hey, we had this emergency come in.
Yeah.
Well, all of a sudden, that's not like, well, I'm going to welcome you with open arms. That's now, I'm rolling my eyes. I'm bothered. I'm bothered with everybody else who let this happen. Or, who called in sick today, and now I'm having to pull double duty on all these other things. And so anyways, this one individual said, hey, thank you so-and-so for sending this to me not long after I listened to it. That very evening, I received 2 emergency phone calls. And this was so front of mind for me, and how I feel like otherwise I would have been just bothered and bugged. And yet this is what I signed up for. Like I'm in this role to be in response to these things. My level of education and experience has put me in a position that these things happen in my work. And how he says so often I just saw those as just impediments to what I was just trying to do.
Inconveniences.
Inconvenient. And he said I approached those calls in a totally different way than I would have otherwise. And I think he said something like, I know the experience was a lot enjoyable for me. I only imagine that it was a lot more enjoyable, for the other on the other end of that call. So yeah, that's a good story.
I know for a fact that the listeners now understand why I love spending time talking to you, Mike. This has been a great hour. I can't thank you enough for your time, for your expertise, and for your wisdom. And I just completely attest to, more than anything I've ever experienced or any podcast I've ever helped produce. I can attest to the value of this that is far beyond simply a leadership course to make more money or to better manage people. This course will change you. And by changing you, or you changing yourself, you will just be a more productive and happier individual. And we wish you all the very best in your adventures with Arbinger, to the extent that you may decide this is exactly what you and your organization needs. So again, thank you, Mike. Thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you, Joseph. Thank you so much for thinking of us and having us on. So appreciate that.
My pleasure. Have a great day.